the 15th of January, 1945. Monday.
Fáy Hildegard,
23 years old college student. Castle District, Attila Street 6. Food is running out fast. Hungarian soldiers keep coming in. Poor things, they're starving. Today a soldier about our age came in, ashamed. He says he only got a handful of dried onions this morning. He leaves with a full stomach, but after a few steps he turns back, his eyes full of tears. I'm afraid to go out, they're bombing again. My eyes well up too. I squeeze his hand seeking help. I'm afraid too. The noise is constant. Engine roar, explosions, impacts. We shout to each other, using gestures like the deaf. The soldiers are running out of food, running out of ammunition. Budapest is surrounded. The siege is complete. Now the Germans are trying to deliver food and ammunition by air. Today the sky was beautifully blue, small parachutes floated towards the Vermes. White and orange, with metal boxes instead of men. They said the German soldiers hurried to collect them. There wasn't a moment's respite today. I joined the caretaker, we went to the school for water at dusk. A soldier was manning the tap, even so we were wading in the cold dusty mud for a long time. The caretaker is already leaving with full cans. It's scary among the swaying shadows in the dim light. I am the last civilian. Outside it's pitch black, a hellish noise, they must be fighting in the neighborhood. My feet are groping for where to step, but there is no sidewalk, just bumps and holes everywhere. Suddenly cold air hits my forehead. Something is coming. From the defensive movement I slide down the pile of rubble to the right, towards the church. I hear the screech of tank tracks in terror, a black mass passes by me at arm's length. My heart stopped beating. This is a tank, and what if it runs me over? My mother would never have found me. Lord, my God, would you please give the guardian angels some time off?
János Tolnai.
15 years old. District 12.
Kis János Altábor Nagy Street.
Some shop owners are still giving away their goods for free, mainly food. They are rationing it so that as many people as possible can get some. This is how I got sugar and fat again. I wanted to pay for them, but the shopkeeper said he didn't need the money, he couldn't do anything with it anyway. He said he'd rather have the Hungarians eat it than let it fall into the hands of the Russians.
Dr. Györfi István.
33 years old eye specialist, eye clinic, District 8 Maria Street 39.
It was very saddening that among the seriously wounded there were relatively many young men who, fearing that the residents of the basement would report them and the Arrow Cross would take them away, did not dare go down to the shelter during the bombing, and the house or apartment collapsed on them. And their number grew day by day. The only thing we could do for them was to check on them every morning, give a cup of tea to those who were still alive, a pill each while we still had painkillers, and transport the dead to the mortuary of the anatomy department next door. For me, our complete helplessness in the face of the wounded was the most horrible experience of the entire siege. To hear them beg us to save them.
Juhász Eszter,
22 years old. District 11. Orlery Street 4. Today we woke up to the pleasant news that German soldiers tried to break into our apartment last night. Yesterday afternoon we were still joking that this sort of thing could happen these days, and now it has already happened. I packed a few things again and took them down to the basement. We don't really know who we need to save our valuables from, because friendship or comradeship aside, the Germans have already looted a few apartments, not to mention the shops. In any case, we took the food down. It would be terrible if a grenade hit the pantry. It was so cold in the apartment that my fingers almost froze off. Carolee took down a window from the other room, which miraculously remained intact, and we want to reinstall it in the dining room. Istvan and I also helped as expert assistants. Suddenly I saw a bright light, almost like lightning in the villa next door, but before I could open my mouth, there was a huge bang, then came the smell of gunpowder and smoke, and the window shattered on our heads. I involuntarily jumped back, tripped over a suitcase, and fell against the cupboard. Carolee followed my example and landed on me. No one was hurt, except he got 3 small shards of glass on his nose. He was so scared that he was almost speechless, and when I offered him a cigarette to calm him down, his hand was shaking so much that he couldn't light it. Anyway, we poured some alcohol into ourselves, and only then did we look around to see what had actually happened. So, a direct hit took off the corner of the neighboring villa, and since this villa is no more than 40 or 50 meters away from us, our last window was also destroyed.
Gressze Ferenc.
42 years old, Roman Catholic priest.
Nagykovácsi.
The Soviet army reached our village last Christmas. The settlement was quickly occupied. No one offered resistance. The Russians poured in, seemingly in endless numbers. Soon, they flooded the entire village. They came like a flock of sheep, some hurriedly, others more slowly. They didn't present much of a military appearance. Among the soldiers were children dressed in uniforms, 14 or 15-year-old boys. It was striking that many of the Russians were unarmed, equipped only with shovels and spades. A small group came to the parish house, one of them carrying a small box on his back containing a radio telephone device. Meanwhile, 2 officers and a woman dressed in an officer's uniform also entered the room. One of the officers took tobacco from his pocket and began rolling a cigarette. Realizing what he wanted to do, I offered him cigarettes from my case. They all took one and lit up. The radio soldier picked up his box and left. The others stayed a little longer, smoking with satisfaction and chatting. After about 5 minutes, they stood up, shook hands, and left. Some were entirely modest, asking for a glass of water or a piece of bread before moving on. Others sat at the table and devoured the Christmas dinner. None of them stayed long. It seemed they were under orders to occupy the remaining villages down to the Danube within a set time. By 3 p.m., the movement of the combat units had ended, leaving only small groups patrolling the village. One such group arrived at the parish house. Their leader was a rather overweight, unarmed Russian who limped and leaned on his cane. He had a dark, distrustful expression. Standing in the middle of the room, he looked around, pointed to the desk, and mumbled, "Bourgeois." Meanwhile, my father entered the room, and the chain of his pocket watch glinted on his vest. The Russian quickly noticed it and asked, "Watch? Hand it over?" We thought he wanted to know the time, so we both looked at our watches. But he wasn't interested in the time. He approached my father, took his watch, then came to me and did the same. Without so much as a flinch, he left with his companions. My father and I looked at each other and concluded, well, we've been liberated of our watches. The first unpleasant surprise? The combat units who had behaved so properly were long gone. It seemed the ones arriving now were the real deal. The entire village was teeming with Russians. Among them were many women dressed in men's uniforms. They had hardened, wild faces. Ugly soldier women. Only rarely did a more feminine face appear among them. The groups going house to house weren't driven by hunger or thirst, but by a desire for watches and other valuables. They searched for German soldiers, in closets, under beds, and even tapping the floors with sticks. They took watches, earrings, sausages, and cheered especially loudly at the sight of wine. The initial good impression was entirely gone. Gradually, the Russians revealed their true nature.
Lajos Nagy.
61-year-old writer and bookstore owner. Pest, District 6.
Around 10 o'clock, Arrow Cross men appeared in the house and raided it. They were hunting for Jews, checking everyone's papers. Mrs. G is half Jewish, has a very Jewish face, and is considered Jewish according to the regulations because her husband was Jewish. But she has false papers proving her husband's Christianity. The Arrow Cross man looked at the papers, looked at Mrs. G, and asked, "How much did these papers cost?" She replied with a smile, "A lot." The Arrow Cross man laughed, gave back the papers, and moved on. Anyone could take this as a cheerful incident. But I was terrified. I felt a strange, deep pain in my heart. The kind you feel before you faint. They're still checking papers. They're raiding. This is what they're thinking about. They have time for it. They have the heart for it. At that moment my real fear began. At that moment I knew that my wife was still in mortal danger. That Arrow Cross man was lenient, that's a truly exceptional case, 1 in 1,000 if it happens like this.